All right, guys, today is an exciting day because I'm going to show you something I've been waiting on for 2 years. So several years ago, I bought an orchid. It was just a small little plant purchase when I was at a garden center and I just couldn't help myself. And it was a cheap garden purchase because it was kind of on their little side aisle where they were trying to get rid of plants, and it was the wrong time of year. The orchid had already bloomed. It had a spike coming up that was brown and dry and dead, and I didn't get to see it bloom. But I thought, I'll bet I could bring this little guy home and nurse it back into great shape and get this thing to rebloom. Well, things didn't go exactly as I planned, but I filmed the whole process. 2 years ago, I started the process of trying to get this thing to rebloom. It's been 2 years since this thing was originally purchased, and it finally has some exciting things going on, guys. All right, there it is, growing beautifully in this grow tent in the house. Now, this thing has come a long way. Look at all those aerial roots. They're so healthy and nice looking, but I've been watching this thing for so long, and it finally had two little spikes starting to come up. I thought they were spikes, but I wasn't 100% sure, and now I'm 100% sure, guys. Look at that. And we've got some beautiful buds wanting to open. It's not focusing very well, but you can see those things are going to be flowers anytime now. And we'll come back at the end of this video and show you how they're blooming. Now that you've seen that and you've seen what it looks like, we're going to go back in time to the beginning of this whole process, and I'm going to show you what I filmed over the years. I didn't think that this was going to turn into anything. I thought this was done. I thought I was going to have a forever non-blooming orchid. But it proved me wrong, and I'm just so glad that I filmed all this from a while back. So let's go back in time in the Kincaid time machine and check this out. Let's go. So for some reason, orchids seem to be just one of those plants that elude so many people when it comes to growing them well. But I've got some tips, I've got some tricks that I think we're going to be able to use to make this orchid grow beautifully and rebloom year after year. So as you can see, I've got this beautiful little orchid here. I bought this recently at a big box store. It was on sale because it was winter time, and it came in this little container right here. And you can see the aerial roots are just busting out of there like crazy. I've got it under some nice fluorescent lighting. It's warm in there. Look at all these new roots just busting out and trying to grow out of there. So this pot is obviously too small. I've got some really neat ideas about this orchid and how we can take care of it in a way that will cause it to grow healthier and healthier and just start growing the spike and blooming like crazy. So here's how my theory goes. First of all, I know plants and plants know me, and so, you know, when I'm playing around with these plants, there's just a vibe between us and we can figure each other out. But here's how I want to help figure out this orchid. First of all, with any plant, you got to realize that it's got a specific area and climate and humidity levels and just all the different factors that go into its growing into its greatest potential. All those things need to be there in order for this orchid to reach its full potential. So before we get into what we're going to do for this little orchid, we've got to understand what this thing likes to grow. So orchids are tropical plants. They grow in climates that are warm and humid. It may rain twice a day, but then the rain goes away and lots of humidity just fills the air. Orchids are epiphytes, and what that means is just plants that grow on other plants. So they grow in places like the crotches of trees where moss and debris might collect. They're also saprophytes, which means that they feed on dead and decaying matter. So another saprophyte that you guys are probably really familiar with is mushrooms. This one, the roots grow out into the air and collect moisture, and then they've got roots that go down into the the organic material and eat off of the organic decaying matter. So like I said, moss and old dead leaves and twigs and needles and things like that are just decaying along the crooks of those branches and feeding these roots. Okay, so it's really just that simple. All this little orchid needs to grow to its greatest potential is a jungle. But we don't have a jungle in our kitchen. So we're going to have to recreate that environment. Now, one of the reasons I think people struggle with orchids is because they pot them up and then they say, well, these roots have to be out in the air, which you can see, look, this is not dead. Like some people clip these off, and you could clip them off, but they're still collecting moisture and water. And you can see, look at that. Look at that little baby rootlet there just coming out of this supposedly dead root. It's still alive. Every part of this plant is alive right now and doing whatever it needs to do to keep this plant healthy. Also, these other roots that are growing out here, these little air roots, if you feel the tips of them, they're kind of tacky in a way, and they're absorbing lots of moisture and nutrients right into them for the plant. So what are we going to do to give this thing the environment it needs to grow? Well, I think one of the biggest problems that people have with growing these orchids is they grow them in their warm, dry house and leave these roots outside of their container where it's dry and there's no moisture for them. Remember, they grow in jungles, so it rains once or twice a day, and then there's all this humidity rising up and constant humidity around all of these roots. So we want these to be in a humid environment. So what I'm going to do is I've already found a beautiful bigger pot. We're going to pot this guy into this pot so it's got plenty of room for the root development. However, we've got to adjust things a little bit for our growing environment because we're in a dry house. So I don't want these roots just sticking out. You can already see this plant is suffering a little bit. It's not getting the moisture it needs because these roots are growing into a dry environment. And so the leaves are kind of drooping over here, not getting all the moisture that they really need and deserve. So I'm going to actually completely immerse this in the soil. Now, having said that, you've got to use orchid soil, and it doesn't have to actually be labeled orchid soil. You can use anything that drains well, is big and chunky, and will allow lots of air to get down in there. So when we repot this orchid into this container, we're going to surround all of those roots. I'm going to plant a little deeper than I normally would. It's going to surround all of those roots, but it's airy throughout there. But because I'm covering them, it's going to be humid in that airy spaces between all of that bark, and that's going to provide the moisture and then the nutrients that this little plant needs to thrive. Alright, so let's get down to it. So the first thing I want to show you is this bark that I bought, and this is actually made for orchids, but you don't have to buy this stuff for orchids. It just looks like landscape supply kind of bark that you could get at any landscape supply dealer there. It's big chunky pine bark. What they say they put in here is some chunky peat. You don't want to use that fine peat that comes in bales that holds too much moisture. It's got to be chunky and let water pass through easily. Then they've got some fir bark here that's ground up chunky, like I said. So I've got big pieces of this stuff. It's not finely ground fir bark like I use for my rhododendron potting soil and my other landscape plants. And then looks like they got a little bit of charcoal in there, and that actually will clean out any chemicals or anything like that that flows through there, chlorines in water, things like that. And a little bit of perlite that just once again helps things to drain well. So just good draining soil is really all you need, but that's all this is chunky, good draining soil. Alright, so let's take our little orchid here, and the first thing I want to do is pull this little stick out of here that was holding the spike up, because we don't need that. You can see that spike was dead and dying. A lot of times you can just prune above a node on that spike and it'll regrow out from there, but this one was old, dead, dried up, and gone. So we're not going to be doing anything with that. In fact, I can take my scissors here and just snip that off even lower and get rid of it. The next thing I want to do is get this out of the pot. So I'm going to be gentle because I don't want to bust off any of these roots. We'll just kind of pull it out of there so you can see that's what we've got, and I love how they've done this. So this company, whoever potted these up, I believe did it right based on the requirements of this plant, and it looks like the same kind of material that we're going to be repotting it into. It's not tightly packed. It's not, you know, a fine material. It's real chunky and loose. Water can flow through it, but it can hold moisture and creates a lot of humidity in there. You can see those roots down in there are still very much alive and growing well. There's no rot at all in here. Exactly what this needs. All right, so I put a little bit of bark down in that pot there. You can see about how full it is. And it's only probably a third of the way full because I want this to set down in there real nice. And I'm not going to disturb things too much. Maybe I'll pull it apart a little bit, but not too much, because it's actually, there's no rot down in there. Everything's growing real healthy, and I want to continue to allow it to grow how it's growing. These guys I'm just going to leave out. That's fine, or they could, you know, do whatever. It doesn't really matter. I got tons of new roots for this thing to grow on. And then all I'm going to do, you can actually, let me show this to you. You can actually see the roots are down in there below where the level of the soil is going to be, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. So let's finish filling this guy back up. It's going to be kind of tough because it's chunky material, but that's exactly what we want for this little plant. We'll pull these leaves out of here. And that's it. We've got our pot completely filled up to the top here. I want to kind of show you. You can see some of these roots right down in here. They're just barely peeking out, but most of them are down underneath this bark. Now, why is it okay to have all those roots under the bark? Well, it's not soil. You would never want to plant this in soil, in like a dense soil like we have in most of the northern United States. So why is it okay to bury those guys in the bark? Well, because it's not soil. You would never want to plant this plant in soil or anything fine and tightly compacted. This is just, like I said, loose, chunky bark and peat. And so when I water this, water's going to flow right through this thing, right out the other side. And what's going to happen is all of this chunky bark and peat is going to absorb moisture. It might swell a little, but it won't expand into the air spaces. It's not going to fill in all the air gaps in there because of just the way it doesn't fit together. And so it will be very moist all throughout. All that bark and all it will just suck up moisture, and then there will be tons of big air gaps and voids in there for those roots to grow into, and all those voids will be full of humidity because all that bark and chunky peat that's moist will be constantly letting off moisture. And that's why I think we're going to be able to grow this guy beautifully inside a dry home. Now, how are we going to get this to flower? Well, there's one thing that you need to understand about orchids, and that is they like to bloom in cooler environments in the fall time and coming into the winter time. And so what do we need to do? We just need to lower the temperature by 10, 15 degrees. Right now I've got this under my T8 bulbs. It's nice and hot under there. You don't see any blooms. If I put this guy out into my kitchen, into some soft, low lighting where there's no direct sun, it's going to be cooler, and I think it will trigger this to start growing a spike and then bloom. We're going to find out. So let's get this orchid inside and water it up and get it in its final resting place. All right, so we've got our orchid here in the house, in the sink, and what I want to do, because all of this material was very dry, I'm turning this water on to where it's just warm, and we are going to water the heck out of this guy, and I mean water it thoroughly. And that might be kind of counterintuitive because, you know, you don't want these orchids swimming in water, but they're not buried in soil. So it is, you can see it's lots of air throughout all those pieces, and it's just draining right through and out the bottom. And what this is going to do is give lots of moisture to all this bark and peat so it can just soak it up really well and become very moist with lots of air spaces throughout it, just like in the jungle. And remember, it rains in the jungle several times a day, so this water I'm just dumping all over this is exactly what this orchid would get in its natural environment. And then the rain goes away and all that humidity forms. All right, so that's it for now. I've set this little guy up right next to our aloe plants in the kitchen window where we've got just some soft lighting. We've got an overhead skylight as well that just kind of provides some gentle lighting. No direct sun at all. The soil is beautifully moistened in there. I put a little fertilizer in there, and I think we're going to see some fantastic results. So we will come back when there's something to show you. All right, so today is April 17th. It has taken this long for those buds to fully open up. Now, it's not completely opened up, but I am so excited with how good it looks and how beautiful it is that I just couldn't wait to get out here and show it to you guys. Look at these blooms. Isn't that just fantastic? I love these things. Let me get a close-up for you. Hopefully that camera's picking them up. And we have got a ton more buds to open up. So there it is, man. I am excited about this. When I saw it starting to bloom, I couldn't hardly believe it because it's been 2 years. I've been trying to get this thing to bloom for 2 years. Been a real healthy plant down in that pot. I only potted it up one time 2 years ago, and it's just thrived in there ever since. You can see all those aerial roots just latching onto the pot. They're actually stuck on there really good, and it's growing super healthy, but that is just absolutely stunning. I had no idea what the colors were going to be until it started actually blooming, because I didn't see it bloom the first time. It was just dead little spikes that were already bloomed and done. But look at the back side of that flower. Isn't that beautiful? Just those soft pastel pink hues. I love that. Absolutely gorgeous. And then as you can see, these buds just keep boom, boom, boom. They just keep opening up as we go. And these are real hardy flowers, so they should all stay on there while this whole thing is blooming. I can't wait to see the whole thing fully opened up. I'll have to get a picture for you guys and put it up on Instagram once that happens. But I really just want to get out here and show this to you right now. So you just watched as we went through a 2-year process of getting these things to actually bloom. So let's talk about how we got them to bloom, or what we did anyway to get them to bloom. So I thought I was going to have this thing all figured out. I thought I was going to bring this home and, you know, pull a few tricks out of my hat and make it bloom. And within months, I quickly realized this was not going to be as easy as I thought. So what did I do? Originally, I up-potted it. I wanted to give it plenty of room to grow some nice, good, solid roots. I had bought it at a store. It was on clearance. It didn't look that nice in the little pot it was in, and the roots were just too full in that pot. It needed some room, so I up-potted it. And then I set it in my windowsill in my kitchen. There's not a lot of light coming through there because there's an awning on the back porch, so they didn't get a ton of... Actually, let me back up. First, I had this in my grow area underneath that table where the fluorescent bulbs are, the T8 bulbs. I had them under there first, and that was for maybe a month or two through the rest of that winter. Then I thought I was going to get it to bloom by putting it out on my kitchen windowsill because it's cooler out there. It was real warm underneath that little grow table area. Out in my kitchen, it's cooler. By dropping the temperatures down, you typically can get these to bloom. Obviously, it didn't work for me, and so it sat on that kitchen counter for the last 2 years. And then once we got this tent going on inside with that Vipar spectral light in there, I think that might have been what did it. I think that might have been what made this thing actually bloom, because those lights are built to have more red in the spectrum for the flowering stages. And once I put it in that tent under that light, I almost within, I think, weeks saw spikes starting to come up on this guy. I was actually shocked at first. I thought, what are those little things? Because I kept seeing little aerial roots coming out of it, but I had never seen anything that looked like these spikes. And once they got up about an inch tall, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Now, this was a slow process. It did not happen quick. This took quite a while to actually unfold. I mean, it's been a month since that last clip to get to this point, and it's not even fully bloomed yet. And so, you know, you're talking months from the time I started seeing those spikes until we actually got to this point. But the payoff is all worth it in the end. Now, I want to get some more orchids. All All right, so let's talk about a few more aspects of things that I did for this orchid. So there are two things I wanted to address. One is fertilizer, and then the other is watering. So a lot of times people will tell you that you don't want to water the leaves of the orchid. You don't want to water down here around the top to where it drips into the base, down around the base of the actual orchid, because they say it will rot the orchid. It can die back that way. I've heard this a lot. I've read it a lot online, and I don't know why that is or why people are saying that, because I did not get that result. So from day one, over 2 years ago when I bought this thing, I've been watering this in my sink. I'll just put it in the kitchen sink. I'll take the spray nozzle, put it down over top of this thing with the full-blown just water running, and just run it over all the leaves, and it cleans the dust off and all that. And I just let it run over the leaves. It spills down into the center of this thing, and water just runs all over it. And you know, I got to thinking, and I was probably doing that maybe once a month, and I got to thinking, I'm not sure why people are saying you can't water from the top, or you can't get the water all over the leaves of this thing or the center, because it worked really well for me. And as I think about it, out in nature, in the wild, in the jungles where they grow, they get tons of rain directly down on top of them anyway. I think where people might run into trouble is if they have these things planted in just standard potting soil. Because standard potting soil is, I don't believe it's a good material for these things, because they have all these aerial roots that grow outside of the soil, and that's where they get their moisture and they get air, and they just grow differently than the typical plants that we grow up here. And so I think putting them in potting soil would be detrimental. And then if you water down from the top, they probably will get waterlogged, probably won't grow too well in that kind of environment. But this stuff is super chunky and coarse, and when I water, I can just let the water pour on it. It just runs right through this pot. All we're trying to do is just get a little bit of moisture in that material, in this chunky stuff. And it's actually fairly dry. It's not, this isn't even moist at all on top. And they just don't need to be wet. And so hose these things down if you've got them in chunky, coarse soil like this. Let water run all over it. You're simulating, just rain, as if it was in a rainforest or in the jungle. And it's going to do that anyway in nature. It just needs some way to get rid of the water. Now, number two is the fertilizer. What did I do to fertilize this thing? Well, I know some people may balk at this, but when I first bought this, it was my first orchid, and at the time I was watering with Miracle-Gro, and so that's what I watered this with. I only did it a few times in the very beginning when I bought it. Watered with Miracle-Gro, let it run right through. It wasn't a problem at all. The leaves turned just a super deep green, and right now they're kind of fading a little bit because I actually haven't fertilized this thing in probably the 2 years since I got this thing out of that grow area underneath the table and put out on my kitchen counter. So it's been about 2 years since this thing got fertilized, and it stood up just fine ever since then. As you can see, it's blooming just gorgeous. And so I don't think they need a whole lot of fertilizer. I think they get what they need out of this bark, this chunky bark and whatever else is in there, and out of the air. Now, I suppose I probably will put a weak solution of fertilizer over it once it's done blooming, just to kind of green up those leaves a little bit. I can tell some of the colors getting pulled out of the leaves to feed these flowers, but we'll just start the cycle over again and repeat, and then I'll probably fertilize them in the beginning and then just stop fertilizing altogether after that until they bloom again. I wonder if we can get these things to bloom faster than 2 more years. There are probably some tips and tricks. I've heard of people putting ice all over the top of the pot. I tried cold water. That didn't work. I didn't try the ice. Maybe I should try that one. But there's probably some different things that we could do. So I think that's it for this little orchid growing video. I'm pretty impressed with how it went. It actually took way longer than I thought it was going to take. At one point, I didn't think this video was ever even going to happen because I couldn't get the thing to bloom. But here we are. We persisted. 2 years later, we've got beautiful blooms. Now, we'll just have to watch this unfold. And if you guys haven't gotten onto Instagram, you should get on there. And if you're not
following my account, there's a link down in the description. It's just mike.kincaid on Instagram, and I will post updates of these as it's fully opened up and blooming. And maybe even, you know, if I think about it when I'm doing another video, I'll just try to include it in the video just so you can see it fully open. But until then, I hope you guys like this one. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe if you want to follow along. Have a fantastic week, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Adios.